kick off. It's 10:01. If there's a couple of late dial-ins, that's fine. We'll handle those. So welcome everyone to the NQ Dry Tropics Conversation Series, where I guess we're aiming to present a range of topics related to the Paddock to Reef Integrated Monitoring, Modelling and Reporting Program. The overall objective of this exercise is to try and increase awareness and understanding of the program as a whole, and I guess to try and demystify and uncomplicate what is a very complicated program. So I guess firstly, a quick explanation of the session. We're here for an hour. We're estimating around 30 minutes of presentation and 30 minutes of question time, thereabouts. I ask that you all mute your microphones to avoid any unnecessary interruptions, and type questions in the chat window, and then we will send those to our presenter, our speaker today, Jane Waterhouse. If you can't use the chat, by all means, use the reactions tab to raise a hand, and we will come to you with an opportunity to ask a question. I do ask that we be respectful to everyone in the forum today and keep questions relevant to the topic at hand. A reminder that all of our previous presentations are hosted on the NQ Dry Tropics website. If you just Google P2R Conversation Series, it will come up. And you will be able to review some of the previous conversations that we've had, and I will give you a quick recap of what they've been. We've had 3 online sessions thus far. Carl gave us an overview of the Paddock to Reef program as a whole, which was a really good, I guess, scene setter. We also had Adam Northey provide a presentation on the Paddock to Reef management practice adoption questions, which again was a really good, useful session to help us understand how those questions have evolved over time and how they're intended to work. And then our most recent conversation was actually a summary of the 2020 report card, the Reef report card, and specifically, how the Burdekin region contributed to that report card. So they were 3 quite topical conversations. In addition to that, NQ Dry Tropics has also hosted 2 face-to-face forums. One was a Burdekin Cane Science Forum down in Ayr, and the second was a grazing industry forum based around the North Queensland Beef Producers Expo out at Charters Towers. Today, I'd like to welcome Jane Waterhouse from C2O Consulting. C2O Consulting have been engaged to independently lead and coordinate a very thorough process to prepare a new scientific consensus statement. Now, I'll be honest, I'm aware and familiar with the scientific consensus statement, but I had no idea just how complicated it is. So I did a little bit of background research, and I discovered that, quite interestingly, the first attempt by an independent panel of experts to prepare or review the science around how land management can influence the reef water quality was started way back in 2002. And the first formal scientific consensus statement was actually produced in 2008. So this is not a new concept. It's been going on for a while now. And I guess there's been a few versions of the scientific consensus statement over the years. But really, it is a very complicated process, and it's also very important. So we've asked Jane, who's leading the process for this review, to come along today and explain to us why the review is necessary, why the process is quite complex, and why it's being overseen by an independent organisation and not by government. So I'd like to hand over to Jane. And again, I ask everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for questions either through the session. Thank you very much, Jane, and welcome.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to NQ Dry Tropics for inviting me to present as part of this series. I think it's a great opportunity to share a bit more info about the project. So I've got some slides, and I'll see if I can get the correct screen up. So can you see the version that's the full slide?
Yes, that's working well.
All right. So yeah, today I'm from C2O Consulting, and I'm representing a team. So also online we've got Katie Sandbrook, who's involved in the coordination team, but she's sort of leading the comms and some of the peer review process, as well as author coordination. We've also got Jo Johnson, Murray Carmen-Panetta, Bianca Molinari and Sandra Erdman. So that's the Scientific Consensus Statement Coordination Team. So we've been contracted by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water jointly with the Office of the Great Barrier Reef to undertake this project as an independent organisation, as Rob explained. So I'll go through and give you a picture of what the actual consensus statement is, because I appreciate that while our heads is buried in it, some of you might not be as familiar with it. So as Rob said, the first one was back in 2002, and they're pretty much updated every 5 years to go along with the update of the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan. So they pulled together the current evidence on land-based runoff to the Great Barrier Reef to try and get a common understanding of the relationship between land runoff and ecosystem health and response in the, I guess, in the catchment, but also in the marine systems. So it's that catchment to reef interface. So what comes from the land that influences the sea, and what are the management options that we have associated with that. So it's strictly based on scientific evidence. As Rob mentioned, in the past, we've done quite different approaches. The last 3 approaches, so 2008, 13 and 17, were based around a number of large chapters based on specific topics of ecosystem conditions, source, risk, and then management options and prioritisation. So I guess we're covering a similar scope this time, but in a different process, which I will go through and explain to you. So one of the primary outputs or the avenues for the use of the consensus statement is for the update of the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, which is happening over the next year or two. So this provides that scientific underpinning, and then there's other avenues to bring in other knowledge, experiences and information. So the actual consensus statement this time round, and it's similar to before, but I guess more structured, we've got 3 big components. So the actual evidence synthesis, so pulling together the science, so that's your technical reports, peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and that comes together around a number of specific questions, which I'll describe to you. Then we have a consensus process. So individual authors answer those individual questions, but then we've got a consensus process involving a broader expert group to say, yes, we get general agreement on that, or here's the areas where we don't have agreement about those scientific findings and conclusion. And then together they form the scientific consensus statement. So you may recall, if you're familiar with it, in the past we have a summary, an overarching conclusion, and then we have the actual chapters. So the evidence of the science, the synthesis of the science sits underneath all of that. So that's our, the big chunks in our process. In terms of the scope, we've got 8 major sections plus the conclusions. So here in the background sections, this is really our context. So what is the value and current status and condition of the Great Barrier Reef, and then how does the system work? So what drives that? So the catchment to reef connections, other processes in the system, some of which are natural, some of which are driven by, I guess, human influence, and then introducing the threats. So we'll talk about climate change in there, as well as water quality, and the 2 combined. So those 2 sections provide the introductory, I guess, context to go on to describe in further detail the themes which delve into the water quality aspect. So the first, themes 3, 4, 5, and 6 really talk about the pollutants. So a catchment to reef story for each of those pollutants. So some of you will be familiar, Steve Lewis has done some of that catchment to reef story in the past for sediments as part of the Burdekin Water Quality Improvement Plan. So it's really building on that, also doing it for dissolved nutrients, pesticides and other pollutants. And for each of those things, we've got a series of questions that answer across that whole landscape. At the marine end, what is the current condition and what are the potential or observed impacts of each of those pollutants on Great Barrier Reef ecosystems? And then the delivery source. So what do we understand about where those pollutants are coming from? What are the things that influence how much is transported and delivered to the reef, and specifically to the end of catchment? And then knowing that, what are the management options? So what are the what is the effectiveness of different management options for each of those sources. So that'll be driven around land uses and looking at the actual water quality effectiveness of those actions, the costs, as well as the productivity outcomes of those management options. Once we've established that, we've got a section which is really about the human dimensions of water quality improvement. So what are the things that influence the choice of programs or instruments that government might choose, but also what are the factors that make that difficult to achieve in terms of barriers, enablers to, for example, the adoption of management practices. And that's not just in agriculture, we are covering off on non-agricultural land uses, including urban, and in the nutrient space, looking at sewage treatment plants, aquaculture, and other intensive land uses as well. There's not a lot of literature on that, but there is some that will be picked up. Our last section is really future directions and emerging science, and we've only ended up with a couple of questions in there, largely because if it's emerging science, there won't be a lot of evidence available for us. But one is really around co-benefits, so it's a really interesting and emerging space and of great interest to policy and management. And that's looking at the co-benefits of investing in water quality, but what are some of the outcomes around biodiversity or other aspects, productivity, for example, that are useful when you're looking at water quality investment, and also looking at, I guess, innovation in monitoring and evaluation is the second question in there. So then after that, our job is to pull that together to tell a bit of a story. You can imagine what the answer is going to be if we have 32 individual questions. And I should say those questions have been defined by policy and management through a series of workshops, but we also had stakeholder input on that to help us prioritise them. And that full scope is how we came up with the 32 questions. Across those, obviously, there's going to be some topics of interest, and that's what these sort of overarching synthesis questions might be. So we would summarise information, for example, by different land uses, so cane or grazing, or horticulture, by certain pollutants, so the nutrient, the sediment story, or by landscape. So we're looking at several ecosystems, so you might just talk about the reef ecosystems, or we are picking up wetlands as well. So that's the scope in terms of the questions. And just to give you an example of the sorts of questions that we're talking about, so I thought to use the nutrients for the lower vertican being relevant there. And this diagram just gives that, I guess, the visualization of the scope. So looking from where those management options are, where the material is delivered, and what the implications are for the reef. And so in that, here's the questions. There's a lot of text on there, and I will encourage you to have a look at the social engagement page that it's like a little website really that Katie has developed for the project, and Rob sent around the link beforehand, because that's got the full list of questions, but this is just in the nutrient theme. So you can see, as I described, we're looking from the reef end, what the impacts are. We've got a specific question around crown of thorn starfish and the role of water quality in influencing those outbreaks, but also looking at other influences on those outbreaks. Then we move into the catchment. So where is it coming from? What influences that? What are the management options? And I'll add in the management options in cane. There's sub questions for some of these as well. There's one around irrigation practices and their effectiveness. There's one around mill mud, and another one about enhanced efficiency fertilizers. So it's really requires the authors to delve into specific questions and answers that policy and management see of interest in future programs. We've also got a number of questions in this theme around wetlands and the role of wetlands in removing nutrients, or potentially removing nutrients in Great Barrier Reef catchments. So that'll be is obviously a very hot topic for investors at this time. So that's an example of nutrients. Similar story for sediments and pesticides. So giving that full from the source to the sink, I guess you could describe it as. So just to pick up on Rob's point, this process has been going for a while, and it has evolved and continuing to improve as we do it each time. And I would say this iteration is quite different to the previous one. So we've, from a range of feedback from the last consensus statement in 2017, you recall in that time we've had the Senate inquiry and we've had a bit of feedback about the science around water quality in the Great Barrier Reef. And so there's a need, I guess, to adopt some other principles in the process to make it clearer and I guess create trust in the outputs. So one of there's 7 principles that we've adopted in our design and delivery of the project. So one is about it being transparent. So increasing the transparency and robustness in the design and delivery, and examples of how we're doing that. Everything that we do is captured and documented. So all of our approaches to every step in the process is clearly articulated and has been reviewed. In, for example, how did we define the questions, how we develop the methods, how we're doing peer review, how we're doing the consensus. And that's available for broader audiences. In terms of minimising bias, so this is the thing that comes up a lot. So we've got authors involved that have previous experience in these topics, and I guess there's a perception that they might be biased towards previous work that they've done. So the method that we've developed for pulling the information together has very specific steps about how do you minimise that bias when you're reviewing the inputs and getting to the synthesis. And we've also got a number of steps along the way with the extra checks from our team in terms of ensuring that the author does a fair assessment and thorough assessment of the available information. It's independent. So as Rob said, we are independent of government, and in this process, government has a role in guiding us on the process and telling us and advising on their needs, but they don't have a review role. And for the first time, we will present confidence. So I guess in the past, there's been concern that there's been, one part of the picture or one side of the story or perception of that. And so this method that we're using to pull together the information actually requires authors to assess and present a level of confidence in the evidence. So we're really sure about it, and most of the evidence lines up to sell the same thing, or is there some sort of uncertainty or disagreement in the literature around a certain topic, or are some parts of that emerging? So that'll be really useful for us to say, here's our foundational evidence, it's really strong, there's really consistent findings in relation to that, and here are the things that probably I guess have some degree of uncertainty, which might be expected, but at least I think it'll be presented in a very clear way. The other ones are fit for purpose. So there's unfortunately no off-the-shelf approaches that we could use to prepare this information, but that's in terms of being fit for purpose for the people that we choose. So selecting the right people for the job, having suitable methods, and then also the processes. And then another big component of feedback as well was around engagement. So having more people who gets involved at which stages, having the opportunity for input. So for example, stakeholders through the Reef Advisory Committee were invited to contribute to the prioritisation of the actual questions. We'll also be asking stakeholders for input on how do we communicate this, and of course there'll be a process of extending the results at the end. And linked to that is making it more accessible. So in a range of forms for a range of audience, and we're seeking feedback on that. So all of these principles have been adopted throughout the process, and we've got, I guess, a fairly comprehensive demonstration of how we're doing that. So in terms of how will the questions be answered, so I've talked about this method. So we've got very strict inclusion criteria for inclusion of materials. So I refer to technical reports or journal articles. So all things included in the evidence synthesis have to be independently peer reviewed. For some things, and publicly available. So for some things that's been more difficult than others to establish, but if we can't ascertain whether that is the case, then we haven't been able to include it. But most things are published in the literature are fairly clear as to whether or not they've been peer reviewed. So we had an open call for anybody to submit literature that they wanted to be considered by the authors through the process. That process has closed now, but we did have quite a lot of input from a range of stakeholders of information that they thought should be considered in this process. So we've got two methods. One's got a high level of, I guess, quality assessment on it. And that was for some of the questions that policy and management really wanted to have that a little bit more in-depth evaluation of the evidence in relation to the question. So they are the management option questions and the impact questions in the marine system. And so this is not our thing. And so we've engaged an external person that's been doing evidence synthesis formal processes for many years. So Rob Richards from Evidentry. So he's developed a specific method which has been internationally peer reviewed by experts in that field. And that is now being used as the formal template that each author has to follow. So the template is fairly strict and requires the authors to go through a number of things around each of the pieces of evidence or reports or journals or whatever it is that they're using. So how relevant is it to the Great Barrier Reef? So where and when was the study undertaken? And if it was done in one location like the Lower Burdekin, is that also reasonably transferable to another location like the wet tropics? So making assessments around that. The type of the study, so encouraging, well, there will be a range of information or types of studies that are picked up. So whether it's experimental, whether it's monitoring information, or whether it's modelling information. So they need to capture all of that. Assessing the consistency in the results. So as I said before, looking across the findings in different materials and saying how consistent are they? Where are the things that are showing up consistently the same across multiple reports or papers? And where are the things where there is inconsistency? So not making a judgment on that, just saying, here's the things that are consistent, here are the things that there is some variability. And then as I described, that overall confidence in the body of evidence. So for an example, something that you might have high confidence in would have a lot of literature around it. It would have used multiple study types, so that multiple lines of evidence thing that we talk about. So it does have experimental work, it has monitoring, it has modelling, for example. And I would say that the Burdekin sediment story from catchment to reef is probably one of the areas where we could say would be an example of where you would have reasonably high confidence in that evidence. And also making a comment on spatial and temporal coverage. So is that Burdekin catchment to reef story relevant also to other areas in the Great Barrier Reef, for example, the Fitzroy or the Cape York regions? So all of that material will be externally peer reviewed by, the actual method was, but also the outputs will be externally peer reviewed, and they will lead into a formal consensus process, which will involve authors and broad experts. And for the peer review process, we're establishing a very formal editorial board, similar to what a journal would have, where we've got probably 5 or 6 members that will make the decisions about the process, set up a format for reviewers to assess the author's outputs, and then we have a role in checking that all of that has been followed, and authors provide the feedback, and we have final products following all of that review process. The consensus process is also being guided by an expert working group, and we will be trying to adapt a process that's relevant for the Great Barrier Reef, but draws on formal processes used elsewhere. There's a lot of consensus of evidence done, of science done in the medical industry, for example. So drawing on some of those approaches to design a process relevant for this scientific consensus statement. So just pulling that together again. So I've described the evidence synthesis, so the answers to the question, then we go into that consensus process that generates the overall combined scientific consensus statement. So in terms of our timelines, we've had quite a few delays. So we started a year ago now, We've been doing the plan and design process through to the middle of the year, and now we're in the delivery, which is great. So we've got authors on board for most questions, but we've just put out an advertisement for filling 2 of the questions. So if anyone's interested in answering a question around pesticide sources or crown of thorns, starfish and water quality, please get in touch. Those applications close next Friday. But we do have, I think it is 29 authors on board. Oh, it must be 30. So they're all starting to work on actually following that template we described with our support and getting advice from Rob, and they are due in February, and then we'll collate that information to go for peer review. And in the middle of next year, we'll do that consensus process and aiming for review of the combined material towards the end of next year with a final product in December next year. And then we'll do the communication process in the following year, so early 2024. One of the things I mentioned earlier is the social engagement platform, which I said is just like a website. So Katie's developed this, and the idea of it is really just to provide additional information and updates and further detail as we go. So you can sign up for that to get updates and receive notifications around that. And in that we will also be undertaking a communication survey, so to get some feedback on what are the sort of products that people would like to see coming from this, so that the information can be shared in a way that's useful for you in your roles or for your sector, or I guess assist in interpreting that massive body of science that we'll be pulling together. So that's it in a snapshot. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen and pass back to Rob to handle any questions.
Thanks, Jane. There's no questions in the chat at the moment, but I'm hopeful that there may be some come through. If I may start with a question, I guess, around, you know, I guess when we came up with the idea of having this presentation, it was about, you know, understanding what the scientific consensus statement is, why it's important, and I guess what purpose it plays in the bigger picture. And I think you've done an awesome job of explaining what it is and why it's important. I guess to try and help us understand a little bit more about what's its purpose in the bigger picture of the Paddock to Reef program and the Reef 2050 plan. Yeah, maybe can I ask you to just give a bit of a general overview of that, and then I might ask a more specific question after that.
Yeah, so the scientific consensus statement in the past has been used to help review the actions and identify if the scope of the water quality improvement plan is still on target. And I guess the material also informs the research, development and innovation strategy. So Rachel Smith, who's actually online, she will lead that in the Office of the Great Barrier Reef. So each of the questions will also identify the knowledge gaps, which is really important. But the outputs inform various parts of that whole water quality improvement plan picture. So the targets and target settings. So I'm particularly involved in the water quality component, less so in the catchment components, but Carl is online if there are any queries about that. And then also the spatial management prioritisation. So some of you will probably be, I mean, you're indirectly influenced by the relative priorities that are in the water quality improvement plan last time, because they are basically said, here's the catchments that are highest priority for management. And then, for example, through the Reef Trust Partnership, they were the ones that were the priority for investment as well. So the information is collated from the responses to those questions and feeds into a number of different projects. And I imagine it's probably relevant also to, although we haven't formally figured out how yet, but the update of the Paddock to Reef review, the review of the Paddock to Reef program, which we'll have to update on the timelines, but I think that this will feed into that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And you mentioned targets, and I mean that's a very topical matter, I guess, in terms of there's been some conjecture about targets and how they're developed and whether they're achievable, and you know how much emphasis there is on some industries and others. So I guess the scientific consensus statement, as I see it, helps to inform how those targets or what those targets will end up being. Could perhaps you or maybe Carl elaborate on how this information that comes out of the scientific consensus statement works in parallel with other parts of the overall program to determine what the targets might be?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of popping a little diagram up of the catchment to reef landscape, and talking to that, because I think that might be helpful in describing the different parts of this that might contribute to that. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So I mean, here's that catchment to reef landscape again. I will say, so the water quality targets, we have a undertaking to update them. We're just working exactly when that will be and what the method will be. But I can describe this generically as in terms of how it was done last time with the existing water quality targets. So as I described, there's a whole catchment to reef picture. So from both the source and delivery components, what are the management options, and then also the marine impacts and response that are covered in the scientific consensus statement. And if we think about how we would develop the end of catchment targets, well, we need to know what comes out of the catchment, where does that go, and what the potential impacts or risks are from those loads delivered from each of the catchments in the Great Barrier Reef. And so what we did last time is we take that material from the end of catchment. It was distributed in the e-reefs model, and we know that coral and seagrass require certain conditions to maintain health, and we can link that back to those nutrient and sediment loads. So for nutrients, we can use different indicators. We use chlorophyll as the indicator for that, and we've got a lot of information from the marine monitoring program, but also from the e-reefs model that tells us what are the sorts of levels that we're seeing, and how are they, how often are they exceeding the levels that we think are healthy, are suitable for maintaining that coral health. And that's what we did last time. So we set thresholds and they modelled how often they are exceeded, and what would you need to reduce that load back to ensure that those thresholds are met more often, or in that case, we assessed it as 90% of the time. And so that's how the loads were determined last time. And the consensus statement this time will be refining our knowledge of what those thresholds should be. It will also be bringing in the climate context. So in the context of increasing climate events, what's the role of water quality, and how long do we think that we have where we can really make a difference from an ecological perspective? And that will help us set a new timeline for those targets. From the sediment story, similar sort of thing. I guess the relationship is probably more with seagrass, and we have a lot of information now about what the influence of different flood events are and how long it matters that you might have reduced light, and what the seagrass system response is. So again, we can review those thresholds that we've used in the past, and the model has now been improved too. So in the past, the marine model used to model only 17 of the major catchments, and now it'll model 66 waterways. So all the little ones that come out of the lower Burdekin will actually be captured in that model. So we'll have more confidence in understanding where the water goes and how it's carrying those materials from end of catchment out to those important coral reef and seagrass ecosystems. And then I guess looking back, so of course that load goes into the model, distributes out into the marine environment, but trying to understand better how you get to this load, and Carl can probably talk more to this, but the consensus statement will pick up that information too. So what is happening at a paddock scale that's captured and represented in the paddock scale model. So individual practice trial information goes into improve those models. So we understand, for example, the benefits or the water quality benefits of an individual practice, that's modelled at a paddock scale up to a subcatchment scale, and that feeds into that whole of catchment delivery from those smaller different practice types into end of catchment. So that model's also been updated. So all the information though that's in the consensus statement gives us a better understanding of how does it get from here to here, what are the factors that influence that, and also what are the practices and how effective are they in reducing, for example, nutrients or sediment loss from a particular landscape. So there's lots of parts of this picture that come from the consensus statement then that can help to improve how the target setting process might be done. That help answer your question? Or Carl, do you want to make a comment? You should. Maybe not.
He's quiet. No, that's really good. Thanks, Jane. I guess another question that I have that I'm sure some of the people listening in would be interested in is, and Carl's now online there, he might be able to help answer it as well, is we're all aware that there's a review going on at the moment concurrently to this, which is around the management practice adoption targets, and that review is nearing its completion. How are those two processes happening, and is there cross sort of fertilisation of those as that process goes along?
Might pass to Carl on that because I'm less involved. Yeah.
Thanks, Jane and Rob. Yeah, so we've engaged Alluvium to have a review of the management practice adoption targets. They've completed that process now and submitted their final report. I think it was the 30th of September. And we're having a look through those recommendations and looking at how they might be implemented and what that might look like. But as far as how that then feeds into the Paddock to Reef program and the setting of water quality targets is that those new management practice adoption targets, whatever they look like, will have to be somehow reported against from the Paddock to Reef program. So we'll have to be able to measure against those new targets. So that will involve changes to the way that we do our management practice adoption recording and data collection and reporting and the analysis. And that then has impacts on the way that we model practices in our paddock models, because they're set up for the current targets. They'll have to be modified in APSIM and Howleaky as to how we report against the new targets. Those changes in the paddock models have implications then into the catchment models. So the paddock models are fed into the catchment models to give us the catchment and the catchment load reductions from the paddock changes. And then that has implications in the marine. So there's this sort of domino effect that we have all the way through from these new management targets will feed into the paddock models, the catchment models, the marine models, and how we set up those marine models to evaluate against the thresholds that Jane was talking about in the marine environment. So we've got a bit of a cascade over the next 12, 18 months of updating all of these models in light of those management practice adoption target changes.
The other thing too, Rob, so the spatial management prioritisation will benefit from the work that's being done through the management practice adoption targets and the Alluvium team. So we will be needing to look at how feasible and the likelihood of adoption of different practices to assist with that prioritisation. So the work that underpins the review of their targets will obviously be really helpful collation for us in doing that. Updated management prioritisation across the 35 basins. So
I guess it just paints a picture of just how complex the entire program is. There's many, many moving pieces. Yeah, and at some point things do have to be broken down into bite-sized chunks so that they can be undertaken and stay on brief. So yeah. Sorry, I'm just looking at some comment. There's a comment there. Oh, yes. Yeah, so as Carl mentioned, there is a report sitting with them at the moment around the management adoption targets. that's currently being reviewed, and that process is just coming to an end. So, so there's no other actual questions. I'm going to open up the floor for any opportunity to ask Jane or Carl a question around around anything in the presentation or related to the presentation to anyone else, because I seem to be doing all the talking. It's not.
I just wanted to mention that I guess in terms of regional relevant information, so in generating the scientific consensus statement, authors have been asked to consider, as I said, information at different scales and for different locations. And one of the things that we'd like to do as the part of the communication process is really to pull together regional stories. So collating the evidence that we have identified that might be relevant to the, say, lower Burdekin Cane area or the broader Burdekin grazing areas would be something that we would like to do. That would be in that period I talked about at the beginning of 2024. And one of the things that we are still sort of identifying is with the regional water quality improvement plans, how does this information fit into the timing of those, which I don't know yet. And I'm not sure if that has been refined, but obviously there's a great opportunity to take the outputs from the consensus statement into regional planning and prioritisation type processes as well.
Okay, I might ask one more question, Jane. You mentioned earlier that there was that opportunity, there was a call for new information for anyone to submit information that they felt was relevant to, you know, the development of the scientific consensus statement. And I know personally I've been to a lot of meetings and discussions where, you know, there's been suggestions that there's more information out there. I guess out of interest, has there been a lot of new information come from that process, or was the body of evidence reasonably well known already?
There's been, well, so that was a broad call. So we've got some really useful new information around some of the technical reports that are generated through various programs that some of this stuff comes up in Google Scholar if you just do a search. So in that case, it should be covered anyway. But yeah, there was some information, and some of it that's been submitted probably doesn't meet that criteria around it being peer reviewed and published and being publicly available. But we did have a good response, and I think that's an important point as well, is that it is an opportunity for people to, you know, submit what they think may have been missed before. And so it ensures that that information is being assessed. So we've got a process where Katie has received those submissions. She's assessed whether or not they meet that criteria of published and peer reviewed. And then where it's been identified as being relevant to a specific question, that author is required to assess that as part of their search with the other literature. And then it's broadly available to all authors, and we keep reminding them that there are a set of papers or reports of specific interest to stakeholders that they should consider for inclusion. So if it's related to a specific question, they're required to assess it, and otherwise we've encouraged people to at least refer to it and assess whether it's relevant to their question. So one thing relevant to that too, so the material that can be included has to have achieved that status of peer review and published material by the end of this year, so 31st of December. So that'll be our cutoff for literature. So I do know that there are people madly trying to get their work peer reviewed still. It's not too late. I think it's becoming close, but probably not a missed opportunity yet. So if anybody's got anything that they've been working on that they think would be critical for inclusion, then you still have time.
It's good to know that that window has been open for an extended period of time. So if there was something out there that probably was relevant but hadn't been peer reviewed, then the feedback loop has enabled that to occur. They've been given sufficient time for that to occur. So that's good. Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, there's no other questions, so I guess we're probably getting close to a conclusion for this session. Jane, thank you very much for your presentation. It is a very complex process that you're leading, and yeah, I really recognise that there's a heck of a lot of work in it, and there's a lot of moving parts. And I hope that by having this session today, people who may not have previously heard about the review or visited the website that you've set up to, you know, inform people of what's going on, at least now, those of us that have, you know, that attended today have actually, you know, have learned a little bit more about the process, what the consensus statement is, why it's important, and how it fits into the big program at the very least. We have recorded this session and it will go up on the NQ Dry Tropics Conversation Series webpage, so it'll be available for people to view later. Most likely we'll share it on the Facebook page, on our Facebook page, so that others can see it and know it's there. And it'll appear on the page with all of the previous presentations, and also the video copies of all of the presentations from our 2 science forums that were held in the Lower Burdick and up in, up in Charters Towers. So Jane, again, thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today.
Thank you for having me.
We all really appreciate the effort that you and the time you've taken to do that. And if anyone has any comments or thoughts about that, about the presentation, feel free to send them either through to us at NQ Dry Tropics, or go to the Scientific Consensus website, the review website, and I'm sure there's a contact detail there that you guys will be able to respond to any questions that are posted. So yeah. Thanks again, Jane, for your time, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you everybody.
All right, everyone, I hope you have a great day. Cheers.